Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get into it. Thanks again, everyone, for coming. We're talking about 3D printing today, one of my favorite things to talk about. Specifically, we're going to be talking about harnessing the 3D printing revolution for blind and low vision students. There's a lot that's been going on in the world of 3D printing over the last couple of years. And so if you have kind of dabbled in 3D printing in the past or been kind of curious, I think now's kind of a better time than ever to dig into this technology. So we'll explore some of the applications today. Quick introduction first. My name is Michael Cantino. I'm the blind technology specialist for Oregon's public schools. I am a Library of Congress certified Braille transcriber for, oh gosh, about 10 years now. I transcribe materials for a project called Project Inspire, which is a STEM Braille literacy initiative, which has been really fun. And I also work on a project called Raise Mathematics. We've been working on automated production of college-level math textbooks into Braille, including tactile graphics, which has been really exciting. And on top of that, I make a lot of 3D printed tactile art and tactile maps, and we'll see some examples of those today. Okay. So quick review of some of the learning objectives we're hoping to achieve today. So by the end of the session, we're hoping that you're going to be able to identify the benefits of 3D printed learning materials. We're going to talk about how 3D printed tactile graphics can help you support access to complex content. So kind of being able to go a little bit beyond what you're able to do with kind of traditional embossed graphics. And we'll learn some really simple modeling strategies to help you start making your own custom 3D models without really spending a ton of time learning something like CAD, computer-assisted drafting. Okay. And I do have the chat up as we're presenting. If people have questions or comments, you can post in the chat. Okay. So before we get into all the kind of finer points of things, let's kind of set the stage here and make sure we all have an understanding of what is 3D printing. So 3D printing is a manufacturing process where basically you give a machine computer files and that tells the machine how to print out a 3D object. And it's going to do that by extruding really, really thin layers of plastic that it will kind of repeatedly pass over and kind of layer those pieces of plastic up until you build up your 3D model. My wife explained it as it's basically a hot glue gun. You have a hot glue gun with a little computer connected to it that's driving it around. I always really liked that description. So that's an easy way to think about it. And the technology here has been advancing really rapidly. 3D printing has been around since the 80s. But we haven't really seen this kind of explosion, or it hasn't really been in kind of the popular imagination until the last 20 years. And even then, in the beginning, machines looked a lot like the machine we see in the corner of this slide, where you kind of really get this idea of like the hot glue gun strapped to a computer kind of thing. You see that exposed controller there at the top. So this machine in the corner is kind of an early rep wrap design. And in 2005, a lot of the early kind of 3D printing patents were expiring. And projects like the rep wrap project were taking the stuff covered in those patents, and they were building upon it and iterating it and sharing all that openly with the community. And that really created an explosion of kind of creativity in the 3D printing space, and led to a lot of the advances that we've seen over the last 20 years. So out of that rep wrap movement, MakerBot was the first to kind of come out with a hobby level 3D printer way back in 2009. And they were okay. A lot of the early 3D printers were, you could technically print things, but they weren't really a pleasure to work with. You were really at that early stage kind of really deep into kind of the tinkerer side of things. Kind of just like getting your machine to go and successfully print was a huge achievement. And the focus was almost more on kind of getting your printer to run and less on like the actual printing and what you're actually able to produce with the printer. Fast forward a bit, around 2017 is when we see like another really big advancement. Prusa Research out of the Czech Republic released their i3 Mark III printer, which was kind of the gold standard for a very long time. Super reliable, really, really great print quality. This is where we're kind of starting to see this evolution from 3D printers not just being for kind of tinkerers and people who want to be kind of having a project where they're fixing up their printer and shifting more into what can you actually do with your machine, which was really exciting. And so that i3 Mark III model really was the gold standard for years and years. And then a couple years back, a company called Bamboo Lab out of China released the X1C, which was kind of mind-blowing. Still is a little bit for me, but this really kind of introduced high-speed printing to the hobby level printers, and also engineering level. So you're able to print with kind of rare materials, really strong materials that we weren't really able to print at home before. So this Bamboo release just a couple of years ago really shook things up. And since then, this kind of high-speed printing revolution has really taken off to where kind of the standard now is that all the new machines are printing very, very fast compared to what we used to print. So a little bit of a history lesson. I say that to set the stage because, again, I think people have been kind of curious about 3D printing for several years. And if you've dabbled in this in the past, you might have been kind of underwhelmed by your experience with kind of earlier machines. The machines now are much more advanced. So let's talk a little bit about that. So why should you start now? Because things have improved so, so much. And really right now, for a couple $100, you can get a 3D printer that is so incredible. I've been printing for about 10 years, and these budget printers now still just blow my mind. They print so fast. They print it with such high quality, and it was something that you could spend thousands of dollars years ago and not get a machine that's as capable as some of these budget printers we see out now. So really exciting time, really good time for people to start kind of exploring this more in depth. So some of the kind of key highlights here, costs have come way down. In addition to that, I'll add kind of the ecosystem around everything has really evolved, where it used to be, okay, it used to be that like searching for high quality materials was kind of a pain. So you could get a batch of material from one company, it'd be okay, and you'd get a batch from another company, it'd be really, really awful. We have like kind of high quality materials kind of across the board now, super easy to find good stuff to print with. So costs have come way down, and the environment has gotten kind of much more approachable and reliable in terms of the materials you're working with. Ease of use has really improved in recent years. You used to have some pretty good technical knowledge and spend a lot of time tinkering with your machines. Not the case anymore. A lot of that stuff that was kind of difficult 5-10 years ago has all been automated on machines now. So ease of use has greatly improved. And so is the reliability. When I used to teach people about 3D printing, even just 5 years ago, I would say, you're gonna have to deal with a lot of failed prints. And that's just something you have to kind of get used to as part of the learning curve while you kind of dial in your printer and get familiar with the process. I don't even watch my prints start anymore, really, because these machines are just so reliable. I send a file to the printer, and I just let it do its thing, and I walk away. It's just not something I would have dreamed of doing just 5 years ago. Connectivity has been a really nice improvement. So a lot of things being controlled wirelessly through cell phone apps, things like that now. Great for monitoring your prints instead of I have my prints down in my basement. Having to run down there every 10-20 minutes is a bit of a pain. Watching it on my phone is much easier. And then the big ones down at the bottom, improved speed, 4x to 10x, depending on who you believe. I think 4x is a pretty reliable number. I think when I compare speeds I'm getting now on some of my newer machines to my older machines. I'm right around 4 times faster than I was previously, which is a huge improvement, especially when we're working in an education environment. A lot of times we don't want to run printers when we're not in the building with our printer. And that kind of limits us to like running 8-hour prints. And on an old machine, that's pretty limiting. You'd be stuck with kind of small size prints. Now that we're printing basically at least 4 times faster, that really opens up the window for what you can do with these machines kind of in a typical workday. Some companies are saying up to 10x speeds. I think that's kind of a gimmick. You can print at those speeds. You probably won't be printing at that speed kind of day in, day out. It's kind of like, let's see how crazy we can get speed. But 4x is pretty much something you can count on. And then multicolor printing has been really a really cool advancement. There were all sorts of tricks we could employ in the past to do multicolor printing, but now it's all kind of baked in. It's super easy to prep prints for multicolor printing and to just kind of send a file up to the machine and let it do its thing. It's very cool, exciting new developments in the field. So if you were kind of on the fence or you had a bad experience in the past, I think it's time to kind of revisit this and maybe think about getting a 3D printer, especially if it's only a couple $100. So all that's exciting and cool, but what I spend a lot of my work focused on is 3D printing for blind and low vision students. I could go through and detail all the reasons I think 3D printers are great for blind and low vision students, but ANZAG has already done it for me, and they've done a really great job. The ANZAG website linked on here is super fantastic. ANZAG's the Australia, New Zealand Accessible Graphics Group, and they have been looking into 3D printed materials for blind students for a long time, and they have a great set of resources and tutorials on their website, as well as these kind of guidelines for when you might want to include 3D printed objects for blind students. So off the bat, it's good to be thinking about kind of 3D printed objects when access to the real object might have some problems. So if it's too small, like a molecule is the example they give, too big, too fragile, too dangerous, it's just kind of something that's not close enough to for you to explore the real object, or it's theoretical, things like that, where for whatever reason, you typically wouldn't be able to have kind of touch access to these things. It's a great opportunity to use a 3D printed object. A lot of times we talk about realia as for tactile objects for blind learners. And so this is kind of 3D objects substituting for that realia, the real object. So other times when it's great to include 3D objects is if the concept, the original concept itself is a 3D one, if the tactile graphic would be too difficult to understand because of kind of different perspectives, that's the example they give. I really like this one of using a 3D object to help learners better understand a 2.5D tactile graphic or a traditional embossed tactile graphic. I think that's really cool and really important. I think interpreting traditional embossed graphics is a skill that really needs to be developed. And I really love the idea of kind of pairing the 3D object that's a little closer to a real representation with that traditional tactile graphic to help the student build their tactile reading skills. Okay. Great for point of view and perspective, and to make learning fun and engaging. Okay. Speaking of that, I think that it's important that we're not just thinking about the classroom. So I have a lot of models I've created for my students that are just kind of toys and games. I think it's good for them to have an opportunity to, one, kind of engage in games with their peers. So there's like a Braille Boggle set on the slide here. This student was able to then go play Boggle with all of his peers in his classroom. They were super excited about it. But also, I think it's important and good for students to have an opportunity in their kind of play with their toys to have something that reflects kind of their lived experience. So I have a photo here of a little stuffed animal with a cane, a white cane, and I have a little bag of mini brailers, Perkins brailers, and we give this to students so they can like use them with their Barbies. I was calling the brailers the Barbie brailers for a long time. And Barbie did release a blind Barbie recently, which has a cane, and folks were really excited about that. My students have had canes for their Barbies for quite some time. So when you're thinking about 3D printed objects for your students, look beyond just kind of educational and classroom stuff. There are ways we can adapt things or give them kind of more meaningful play and leisure experiences. So opportunity there too. There are tons and tons of free educational models available on the internet. I'm not going to dig too much of this in today because it's kind of just like throw a stone and you'll find an educational model. It doesn't mean that everything you need will be out there already, but there is so much to choose from. So I've listed a few websites here on this slide where you can go check out models. Thingiverse is the biggest one. Printables is one that's coming up and been gaining in popularity a lot. And then I really like My Mini Factory, has lots of cool stuff. In particular, My Mini Factory has a section called Scan the World, where museums around the world are scanning pieces in their collections and posting them to My Mini Factory. So you get really high quality scans of like really famous, important pieces of art, sculptures and things like that, just available for you to download and run off on your printer. And I've done that for a few different students and had some success. On this slide, I have an animal cell model that's kind of been printed in several different colors. I have a frog dissection kit, which is really nice. And then I have an anatomical model that's showing a bone structure on one side and a muscle structure on the other side. So lots and lots of stuff out there to explore. Okay. I think I'm making maybe too good time today, so I needed to slow things down. So there are lots of benefits working with 3D printed educational materials. Obviously, great opportunity to kind of customize the learning experience for your student to help address their specific needs. I really like using interactive models, especially when students are kind of struggling to understand a concept. If you can give them a model that lets them kind of explore that concept more naturally in a hands-on way, I think that's a really great way to use this technology. I'm thinking of like, there's a model that shows, excuse me, that proves like the Pythagorean theorem. So that would be like a squared plus b squared equals c squared on a triangle. And it has little pieces you can move around so that you can kind of explore that concept tactily and see like why that is true or how that plays out. So really great for those hands-on experiences. It's also great for spatial concepts that can be really difficult when they're presented in 2D, especially something like a tactile graphic. We talked about that a little bit earlier. And then again, adapting toys and games, I think is a great way for us to give our students access to things that they might otherwise not really be able to access in a full way. So lots and lots of great stuff to do here. Okay, I see in the chat that Beth says, concerns about plastic, yeah. Because you already have developed a lot of good concepts to understand the item. Yep, that's true. And kids will need some opportunities to kind of play and explore these things. I mean, just like reading 2D tactile graphics is a skill to be developed, I think learning to work with 3D graphics is also a skill to be developed. A lot of the work I've been doing is kind of a bridge between the two. I've worked with some students in the past at the college level where some of these kind of realistic 3D models were still a real challenge for them. And so a lot of my work has been, how do I kind of bridge this gap between the kind of the limitations of 2D graphics and not quite the kind of full realism of 3D graphics. Okay. Oh, and items and movies they don't have access to visually. Very cool ideas, yes. I also struggled with kind of the plastic issue for myself for a bit, but at this point, I'm kind of solely printing educational models. And so I'm kind of like, well, you know, it's going to a good purpose, and I'm not, there are more people using more plastic than I am. So I am still successfully sleeping at night. Okay, so speaking of that kind of bridge, I gave some kind of preamble there. I had been working with a college student studying art history, Braille reader, and they were struggling. We printed off some of those kind of realistic models from Scan the World, like I mentioned before, and they were struggling with those and thought, okay, there's got to be some way where I can kind of have a graphic that is easier to interpret or kind of bolder or more nuanced than I can get on a paper graphic, but not quite this full realism. And so this is what we're going to be talking about for the next 15 minutes or so. Tactile graphics and what I call 3D printing wrong, or what I've been accused of as 3D printing wrong. So when we're talking about traditional tactile graphics, there are some limitations, especially depending on the machines you're using. So I have kind of come up using View Plus embossers, where we have a variable dot height, but realistically, you can get maybe like 3 discernible dot heights, where you can really distinguish one dot height from another. And that's kind of best case scenario when you're talking about paper tactile graphics. For a lot of machines, like your Index, Juliet, those kinds of embossers out there, you get 1 dot height. Same thing if you're working with like a P-off machine, a picture in a flash, a toaster, whatever people call them, microcapsule. You really get 1 kind of height there. And so it's really hard to distinguish one shape from another, or kind of what's important. So that is a kind of major limiting factor there. In addition to that, or because of that, there's a really hard time conveying foreground versus background. And so what we end up doing a lot of times, we just strip out the background, right? Which kind of goes down to that last point here, which is we are really kind of significantly simplifying images in order to bring them into this tactile format, and kind of work well with the media that we have available to us. And then the final point on here, highlighting key details is really difficult. We have just a couple tools in our tool chest for that. Like we can use really thick lines. We can create lots of negative space around something that's a key detail. And if you have variable dot heights, you can get a little bit of that. But again, kind of really limiting what your options are for how you're drawing reader's attention to important items in a graphic. And on the slide here, I have some animal graphics of a lemur and a blue whale that I designed for, I think this was Project Inspire. It might have been Animal Watch. Okay, so as I've kind of been alluding to, I see 3D printers as a way to address some of these limitations. When we're working with 3D printers and creating 3D tactile graphics, we have unlimited variety in height. I can make something a fraction of a millimeter, or I can make it up to my biggest printer, 500 millimeters, really, really big, and anywhere in between. So we kind of get rid of that limitation of having no variety in dot height or very limited. This also lets us really kind of separate the foreground and the background in a way that we can't with traditional tactile graphics. So if I raise up something like in the image here, there's a plant that's sitting in front of like a water scene, and that plant sits up on top of everything else. And it's kind of easier for the reader to find that thing and to understand that this piece is separate from the background behind it. Exaggerated details is probably the big one for me. Being able to draw that reader's attention by what I typically do is make it bigger, right? So I kind of, with a lot of my pieces, the biggest, the tallest thing is what attracts the reader's attention and lets them kind of quickly figure out what is the focus of this piece. And because we're able to, with these kind of variety in heights, readers are able to kind of identify and locate things faster. That lets us have a bit more leeway in the amount of detail that we're including in graphics. So in some of the graphics we'll see coming up, I may have omitted a lot of the details in these images in a traditional tactographic form because everything would start to blur together. But because readers can kind of quickly find points of interest and discern kind of one shape from another more readily with 3D materials, I'm able to kind of build on that and include more detail than I would otherwise include in a traditional graphic. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Okay. So I've been kind of talking about this as 3D printing wrong. I've been accused of 3D printing wrong because the argument is that I'm not kind of using my 3D printer to the fullest extent because my materials aren't quite 3D. They're 2.5D, which we also use for kind of traditional raised line drawings. But really, I think we're able to exaggerate this more than those. So while some people say, you know, this is not the best use case of this, I think it's really interesting. I really like this approach. And one of the things I really appreciate about this is that it is still very similar to the traditional embossed or paper graphics that students are working with. So we're not just kind of throwing them in the deep end and giving them a real object that's fully 3D or anything. We're kind of creating this bridge between what's kind of the traditional embossed graphics that you're used to seeing, and we're just kind of, I described it in one article as like, it's just like a embossed graphic where things are kind of leaping off the page at you and drawing your attention. So I kind of like this kind of area in between. And there's something in the chat about usernames for where you can look at examples of my work. I will see some of those later. So thank you for asking. And we're going to see a bunch of examples coming up here. On this piece, I have, this was a really early prototype. This is a Picasso piece where different features are raised up to different heights. Okay. Now we're going to dig into some examples. And this kind of goes through a bit of a timeline here. So let's look at these 2.5D tactile graphics, the 3D printing wrong graphics. So I started 3D printing around 2015, and we were printing things like animals, like a bear or a horse or something that kind of young blind students weren't able to really explore tactily otherwise. And kind of through that journey, we started landing on tactile maps and using them in mobility lessons. And we thought, okay, this is kind of a cool and really helpful approach. We're able to kind of convey things in a way that's easier for readers to explore. And so started to kind of run with that idea, and I was making a lot of tactile maps. And then around 2018, I was going back to school, and I got a research assistant job at Portland State University, and we were partnering with Cornell Tech to make interactive 3D printed models. So the idea was you could explore these models by touch, and as you explored the model, annotations would be read out about kind of which area of the model you were exploring. It was super cool. That application's no longer available, which is a bummer for me. I'd be using it a lot if it was still around. But it was a great learning experience. And we really kind of dove into this tactile map making. And this is where I kind of started to refine my workflow for these kinds of graphics. One of the big takeaways for me that kind of influenced a lot of my work since then is this map in the top left corner that's kind of hard to see. It's cut off. This was a mobility map for an adult who had been kind of struggling to learn his route from the bus stop to work. And he really liked this map. He thought it helped him really understand his route well. But one of the things he said as he was exploring the map was I had made the bus stops quite a bit taller than everything else on the map. So as you kind of quickly scanned the map, you would find the bus stop quickly. And he said, it's like it's just kind of jumping out at me. I know exactly where it is. I just kind of quickly look at it. a quick scan with my hand, and I find the bus stop, it just leaps out. And I thought, okay, that's really cool. I can build upon that. And that's where a lot of this work kind of tends to go then from there. So after, or while I was doing this research work with PSU, we were also asked to make, well, PCC, where I was working at the time, was asked to make this map of the Portland State University campus. So this was kind of taking that tactile map workflow I had been developing and kind of taking it to the nth degree. Just like, so what if we take the same workflow, how far can we take it? And this is kind of using 3D printers, laser cutters, vinyl cutters like a Cricut machine, kind of the works, to kind of build upon this approach that I was undertaking. So the PSU map was a fun project, and I've gone smaller since then. 2020, we're in lockdown and working with an art history student. I started kind of experimenting with 3D printed tactile art a bit more. And so on the screen here, some of my kind of early experiments for these pieces. And I started to kind of realize that you really can layer things. So again, we can get that separation of the foreground and the background, and then kind of extending that to say, well, then we can layer within objects as well. So then we can start to include more details in kind of this one feature than I would typically do. So kind of exploring how we could possibly do this. And at the same time, I had another student doing a lot of STEM courses, and I was exploring the use of lithophanes. So if folks don't know, lithophanes are typically used to create like a 3D printed version of an image, and you shine a light through the background and it looks like a grayscale version of the image. The cool thing about this is when you create a lithophane, it basically inherently creates a tactile version of that image. Now, if you're going to use those things as tactile graphics, you have to be really careful about the images you're selecting. Not everything's going to work well for this approach. And to really make things readable, you may need to do some additional processing. So some of the things I have up here, in the top right corner, these two models are related to each other, and this is illustrating muscular dystrophy, and I believe what it does to the muscle tissue. So on the top one, we can see someone without muscular dystrophy, and in the bottom, we can see someone with muscular dystrophy, and kind of the disordered versus the ordered pattern here. So this was something I didn't really have to process on its own. I just kind of took a lithophane and printed it out. This image worked well. Everything else here, I had to do some post-processing to make it more meaningful, to kind of exaggerate key features. So in particular, something like these spiral galaxy models on the bottom, I created a lithophane, I exaggerated all the features quite a bit, and then I went in and did some sculpting to really highlight the shape of the different spirals in these galaxies. Okay, back to tactile maps in 2021 for the Mobility Matters conference. I think we were still in lockdown here. So this was a virtual tour of the Fort Vancouver National Historic Site. And with a bunch of PSU grad students, I designed these maps, and then we printed over 200 of these and mailed them out around the country. And we start to see kind of some of these same features. So again, kind of reminiscent of traditional tactile graphics, or 2D tactile graphics, but we're exaggerating things so that they're easier to find and easier to interpret. So we could say to a student something like, where are the stairs in this piece? And pretty intuitive once you feel that shape, what the stairs may be. And easier to find and locate than kind of in a traditional tactile graphic. Building upon that, from my kind of previous works with tactile maps, I really like this idea of kind of showing paths of travel with these dashed lines. So for this project, this was a tactile map for another historic park. This is the Manhattan Project Park in Hanford, Washington. This is showing routes that you would go in a tour of the reactor there, the nuclear reactor. So at the very center, there's a big dot that says start here, and then all the kind of paths of travel radiate out from that dot with different shapes for the separate paths of travel. So there's kind of a short dash, a short round dash, a long round dash, and then a square dash to show the various routes with kind of highlighted points of interest all along the map. Okay, and then more recently, I've had an opportunity to do more 3D printed art things, kind of in this 2.5D style. And in particular, my last project was funded by a grant from the French-American Museum Exchange based on their Please Touch exhibit, which was really cool. So we chose 4 pieces, and I made some tactile versions of those. Take a look at these. So as we were selecting pieces for this, I kind of tried to select pieces that would kind of help guide users through this kind of new medium of tactile graphics. So I went from very simple and tried to kind of build the complexity in each piece. So first example is this Wait and See 1312. Very simple. The original piece is just 4 rectangular pieces of, this is like expired photographic film is what they're using. And the tactile model is very simple. And when you look closely at the different rectangles, there are some really, really subtle textures, kind of similar to the original version. If you look really closely, you can kind of see something. So I kind of mimicked that in the tactile version. If you're paying really close attention, you can tell that there's kind of a subtle texture there. It doesn't really leap out to you as something you need to be paying attention to, but you can tell there's something happening. This ox water piece is one of my favorites. And so the kind of swirl of the waves is in 2 tones. There's a light and a dark tone, and those are at different heights in my pieces. But not, they're nearly the same height. I'll say it that way. So when you feel the piece, you can kind of readily tell that one of these layers is at a higher height than another, but they're not so tall and kind of, there's not such a big gap that you start to think that these are 2 separate things, right? So we're kind of tying them together where they're at similar heights, but they're tall. There's enough of a distinction that you recognize that this dark layer is different than the light layer. So readers have really liked kind of feeling the swirl of the waves and exploring the kind of difference between the kind of light and dark layers here. Another cool thing we have happening here is a really kind of, how do I say this? Really clear distinction between the foreground and the background. So I probably have, maybe like a centimeter or 2 between the tallest wave and that wooden background in the back. So when you explore this piece, you're kind of drawn to that wave first. That's the focus. But if you go and explore more, you can find that background and spend some time exploring that wooden texture there. Okay. The watermelon piece was really fun. This is one where I thought, well, you know, if I just do this like I would do a traditional tactile graphic, you're not going to get this forced perspective. It's going to read as just kind of like a triangle, a flat watermelon piece. So what I did was I printed my flat watermelon piece and I mounted it on a little wedge. So this is my kind of tactile way of conveying this forced perspective. So when you come up to this piece, you kind of understand that you, in the original, would be kind of viewing this from an angle. It's kind of forcing the reader's hands to explore the rind a little bit, which you see in the original, and to explore that kind of side of the watermelon. So again, kind of understanding that we're not just looking at this kind of flat head on. And so I thought that was really cool and something we don't typically get in paper graphics. And then this one's the most complex. So after you've spent some time exploring all these others, the most complex here is Monstro the whale. And here I think we're really getting into a level of detail that we would absolutely not be able to include in a traditional graphic. So something like these circles around on the whale's back here. And there's kind of this gray texture behind those circles. In a traditional graphic, all of that stuff's going to blend together. This plant with a wave pattern behind it, in a typical graphic, that plant and the wave are going to be at the same level. It's going to be hard to tell where that wave ends and where that plant begins, and that kind of one is maybe meant to be read separately from the other. So there's a lot going on here. The whale's the tallest piece, so it kind of draws your attention in, and you can spend some time exploring that. I think what I kind of like about these is because everything's at different heights, you can kind of quickly scan something, get a kind of quick idea of what is the main focus of a piece, and then you can spend as much time as you want kind of exploring the details of the different areas. So this has been really cool. Okay. In the chat, they're saying, who could a museum reach out to bring something like this to their audiences? They can reach out to me. I have some contact information at the end. And I'm working on a couple more pieces for the Portland Art Museum right now, which I'm really excited about. Okay, so maybe I've sold you on this so far. I don't know, maybe, hopefully. I've been trying to sell people on this for I don't know how many years. And it's getting a little easier now that printers are getting better, and I've had opportunities to kind of work on some kind of bigger, bolder projects. So maybe you're thinking about how you might start creating your own 3D models. And it can be kind of intimidating at first. There's a lot of kind of complex software out there to start creating your own models, but it doesn't need to be that complex. There are some kind of really, really beginner-friendly stuff that's either like totally hands-off or very minimal effort on your end. So we're going to talk about some of those so you can start getting some ideas of how you might create your own models for your students. Okay, starting out, oh wait, I have a setup, I have a preamble. So there are so many free 3D models online, and you could really spend lots and lots of time just printing those 3D models and having some good experiences with your students. But eventually you might find that you're not finding exactly what you might need for a given situation. And really, to make the most of your printer, you're going to want to start creating your own models. Whether it's creating your own kind of simple tactile graphics or modifying other models, having some basic modeling skills will really serve you well. So let's look at some options. Okay, starting out with TouchMapper. This is one where this is like a zero effort tool. You go to the TouchMapper website, you type in an address, and it spits out a model for you, and then you just go print it off. This is where I started. When I started making tactile maps, TouchMapper is what I started using. Eventually, I kind of outgrew this. We'll talk a little bit about how this relates to kind of typical practices in transcription. But I digress. TouchMapper is a great starting point. One critique I have of TouchMapper is the maps can be a little dense. So keep that in mind. While you're working with this tool, you might kind of explore. There are some different settings you can tweak that might give you a map that's more readable. Another nice thing with TouchMapper is they don't just offer 3D models for your maps. They will also give you files that you can use on something like a P-off machine or a toaster. Hi, dog. Lithophanes. We talked a little bit about lithophanes earlier. I have an image here in the bottom right corner. Some folks may have seen this in the past. But a few years back, there's a chemistry program out of, it's Baylor, was doing some 3D printed, sorry, my dog is impatient, making some 3D printed models of some chemistry diagrams, or I'm not entirely sure of what you would call this, some chemical analysis. And this is a really great application of a lithophane. So there are tons of lithophane generators online. They all kind of work the same. You submit an image to them, you can tweak a few minor settings, and it's going to spit out a model for you. So again, you don't have to do any design work, you just feed it the image. This works well with really simple images like the one we have here, but it won't work for everything. And this is a debate I'm having with some folks, kind of ongoing. Lithophanes are kind of inherently tactile. It makes kind of a texture from your image. It doesn't mean that's going to be a meaningful tactile object for your students or for learners. So really great tool when you're starting out. I mean, there's some other great applications you can use with this, but just because it has a texture, it doesn't mean it's going to be a meaningful tactile object, something to keep in mind. Okay. Here's a recent experiment I did with some lithophanes. So this was a student, just a middle school student studying, this was, oh, what were they studying? I think they were talking about earthquakes and kind of fault lines. And so we had this topographical map of this is like South Asia, see India in focus there, but also kind of the topography and the ocean floor there. And we wanted to create a tactile version of this so that the student could explore the kind of topography of the landmass and also in the ocean. If we just give this to a lithophane generator, the landmass and the ocean are all going to be the same height. And so it becomes really, really difficult to tell where the land ends and where the ocean begins, especially with the way this particular image was provided to us. So what I did is I created two separate lithophanes. So I edited the image so I had just the land and just the ocean. I processed them as lithophanes separately, and then I stitched them together. So as a result, what you get is the land really being exaggerated here, high above the ocean, so it's quick to find where the landmass is, and the student can kind of readily explore the land versus the ocean and the topographies there. Okay. When you're kind of moving beyond some of these automatic model generators, Tinkercad is a great place to start when you want to start digging into making models of your own. They have really, really great tutorials online. If you spend about 15 minutes with those tutorials, you'll be making your own models shortly after. So I really love Tinkercad. This is another one where I started with Tinkercad. I still go back to Tinkercad constantly. There are some limitations, but on the whole, it's just so easy to use and really easy to kind of get models in, edit them, and send them out, or to make basic models on your own from scratch. So I highly recommend Tinkercad if folks are kind of looking for a beginner tool. I will say there aren't many accessible 3D modeling programs. Tinkercad is not an accessible 3D modeling program for a screen reader user. If you're using magnification, you should be able to access the user interface fine, but not something for screen reader users. I'll have some examples or an option for that later on. Okay. Ooh, okay, I'm doing all right on time. We're gonna do a quick kind of demo of this. We'll look at Tinkercad a little bit. So this is another thing I've been trying to pitch for several years, which is hand-drawn 3D prints. So you don't need to be a whiz in Tinkercad, especially kind of making organic shapes in Tinkercad can be tough. But if you just want to kind of do this 2.5D design, you can hand draw your designs. You are impatient, young lady. Sorry, that's the dogs. You can hand draw your designs and create SVGs for them, open them in Tinkercad, and you are ready to go. So I want to do a demo of this. So I believe I have this up. Okay. So I created a few kind of demonstration designs. One is, let's see if we can get this with the blur on. Maybe a little bit. We'll see the image in a moment. I created a simple tactile map of, we have a track meet every year here in Oregon for our blind students. And the kind of layout of the track meet's the same every year. So here's the thing that I drew on a piece of paper here. There's kind of the track. This triangle would represent kind of where the tent is set up, where all the kind of visitor stuff is. They usually have like a discus throwing thing, a javelin throwing thing, and then over on the far side of the field, there is a long jump activity. So I created some kind of key points of interest here. And I can make this into a 3D model in just a few steps. So I'm going to go to picsvg.com. There are a few different options for SVG converters online. This is just the one that I've been using for a long time. And I'm going to choose my track meet map. And when I put it through the process here, it's going to automatically create that into an SVG. I can download that, and I'll go into Tinkercad and import that SVG. It'll take a moment, and then I will get a 3D version of that drawing. Okay, just like that. I can just put a square behind it, and Tinkercad's made this a little bit harder to control that. Okay. I can put a square behind it and then print that off of my printer. The final model would look something like this. Right? Very easy. Same thing, I have an Einstein here. So this was just, I found an image of Einstein online. I saved that image. I ran it through the SVG converter tool, and then I opened it in Tinkercad. And then the final example I was going to show, though I'll kind of skip it for time. Actually, it might be okay on time. I drew a model just in Paint on my computer, and then I can open that. Let's do a quick one of that. And here we go, sample out. And again, this internal one seems to work well for this approach. I'll download my SVG, open it in Tinkercad, and I'm good to go. So super easy. You don't have to be able to kind of take all of these shapes here in Tinkercad and build all of these different paths. You can just draw it on a piece of paper, draw it in Paint, find an image online, convert it to an SVG, and you are just about done. Okay, so that's my pitch for hand-drawn 3D prints. You don't need to design everything in a modeling program from scratch. This kind of SVG approach really captured my imagination. In particular, around the time I kind of started 3D printing, I was working full-time as a Braille transcriber, and I was making a lot of tactile graphics in Adobe Illustrator. And eventually I kind of realized, okay, well, I can use all these SVGs to create these 3D models, but if I'm working in Adobe Illustrator already, I'm making SVGs for all the tactile graphics I'm producing every day. So then I started, okay, well, I can take my normal kind of Braille tactile graphic workflow and just bring it into my 3D workflow. And that's still how I do things. So I still am kind of starting with an original image, tracing that image, and then I'm bringing it into my 3D modeling programs to create my actual final 3D models. Another kind of perk of this is that it makes it a little easier to apply some of the existing tactile graphics standards. So there aren't tactile graphic standards right now for 3D tactile objects, but using this kind of 2.5D approach, because we're borrowing so much from traditional embossed graphics, we can apply some of those BANA standards to this workflow, which has been really helpful for me, in particular for things like the tactile maps. And I hope the dogs aren't too distracting behind me. Who knows what they are getting up to. A little bit more into the SVGs. So if you're buying into this SVG kind of pitch, there's so much you can do with these. I did a presentation years back about creating the PSU map from one SVG file, and that is really, truly how we did it. There is kind of a print image here, this really colorful image is the one SVG file. So we used that to create all the different cutouts that we used with the laser cutter, all the different cutouts we used on the vinyl cutter like a Cricut, the things that we sent to the 3D printer, and then our print layer, just our ink print layer that we put underneath that. All of this came from one SVG file. There's really so much you can do with these files in addition to just embossing them. So really cool thing to explore for folks, and not too difficult to get started with. Okay. And then finally, I promised an option for screen reader users, for blind users. OpenSCAD, or some people call it OpenSCAD, is a text-based modeling program. This does work great with screen readers. I know schools like the Texas School for the Blind has been using this for their students for quite some time. It has a bit of a steeper learning curve than Tinkercad, but once you learn a few commands, there's a lot you can do. So I've linked an OpenSCAD cheat sheet here where you can start to learn some of those basics. And in that cheat sheet, it has links to even more explanations, which is really helpful. And I also have a link to my preferred Braille labels. Oh, and it links to my website because I just created a new one. So I have two versions here. Basically, one is used with Braille translation software and one is not used with Braille translation software. And I've made some improvements on past models that I've had. So definitely something to check out. I still use OpenSCAD for all of my 3D Braille labels. And it worked great. I get really high quality labels from this. Okay, I think that is just about everything. I have some resources for you all. So there is a 3D printing listserv. I believe this is the one run by Judy Dixon, linked here if you're interested in collaborating with folks. 3D printing for blind users. A link to the ANZAG webpage. We looked at their guidance earlier and some of their recommendations. They have so many great resources on their site. I have a couple links to articles here about some of my past work. This one, Beginner's Guide to 3D Printing for TSVIs, is kind of all the basics you need to know when you're getting started with printing. Like, where do I find models? What materials should I be using? How do I prepare models to be printed? All of that good stuff. This article about the art in the Portland Art Museum talks a little bit more about my approach to those pieces. Blind SVG is really interesting. So this is a graphic designer who is blind, and he has been working with SVGs. So if folks don't know, SVGs are all those kind of visual, pretty things we looked at earlier, but underneath the hood, it's just text. And so on blindsvg.com, he teaches you how to create images with those text prompts. So kind of a 2D version of that text prompts that we looked at for OpenSCAD. And then finally, tactiles.edu, or excuse me, .eu is a online repository of 3D models kind of focused on blind users, so tactile models. Okay. And then finally, here's my contact information. If you go to my website, mcantino.com, you'll see examples of some past work, and you can contact me there. You can also contact me at my work email here, which is mcantino@nwresd.k12.or.us. And my phone number, and my day job website is also listed here on the Beavis Tech website. I have lots of resources for state testing, 3D printing, various tech, and these AI chatbots, which have been fun to answer questions about the Focus 40 and JAWS and things like that. And I think that is my time today. If people have questions, you can put them in the chat. Otherwise, thank you all for coming.